Have you ever wondered, why do animated films, where everything looks innocent, fun, and safe, often tell stories very similar to our real world? It is a world where the law doesn't always protect justice, a world where power doesn't need violence to exist, and a world where inequality isn't an accident, it's the result of an entire system. We often think of power as the police, the military, and prisons, violent, direct images. But in reality, the most sustainable power is invisible power. It lives in laws, in social norms, and in the things we accept as normal. Today, we will look at 3 films: Zootopia, 2016, A Bug's Life, 1998, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1996, not as 3 separate stories, but as 3 segments of the same power structure. It is a structure where the law often follows power, a place where order is prioritized over justice, and where inequality is not caused by a single bad actor, but by the entire system operating together. The question is not, who is the villain in these movies, but rather, what system created those villains, and which version of that system are we living in? We need to agree on one thing. What is real power? Power is not just the ability to coerce others through violence. Power is much more sustainable when it makes people obey voluntarily, because they believe that system is reasonable, necessary, and the way things work. In other words, the strongest power is not the power that makes you afraid, but the power that makes you believe. This is where the law enters. Theoretically, the law exists to protect fairness, ensure order, and treat everyone equally. But in reality, laws are often written by those in power to protect the very structure that put them there. The law does not create power. It legitimizes existing power. It turns asymmetrical relationships into natural order. It turns privilege into a legal right. And it turns injustice into regulations. This is when we need to distinguish between individual injustice and systemic inequality. Individual injustice is when a specific person is treated poorly by a bad person, a wrong decision, or a wrongful act. But systemic inequality is when the entire system is designed in a way that one group always has the advantage, while another group is always at a disadvantage, even if no one intentionally does evil. Zootopia, 2016, Systemic Bias. You can replace a police officer, a judge, or an official, but if the rules, norms, and collective beliefs do not change, the final result remains the same. This is the key point. We are not just looking at the villains, but at the system that allowed them to exist and be protected. Zootopia is introduced as a paradise of diversity. Anyone can be anything. But that slogan is the first layer of language hiding a deeper power structure, where not everyone actually has access to the same opportunities. A Bug's Life, 1998. Power through habit and fear. Zootopia does not say the law is bad, but it poses an uncomfortable question. If the law is designed by those in power, who is protected first? In Zootopia, the system is still young and seemingly accidental. But what happens when that system learns to protect itself? A Bug's Life takes us back to a cruder, but no less effective, power structure, exploitation maintained by habit, fear, and the resignation of the majority. Here, the law does not discriminate on paper. There is no law banning rabbits from being police officers. But in reality, the system operates according to implicit bias, who looks like someone in power, who fits the image of a protector of order. That is the nature of systemic inequality. No one needs to say you are not allowed. They just need to create an environment where you are not expected, not trusted, and not empowered. Furthermore, who does this system protect? When predators are labeled dangerous, the government's response is not to ask, where has the system failed? Instead, it is to strengthen control, surveillance, and classification. The law is used not to heal society, but to reassure the fears of the majority, even if the price is the freedom and dignity of a minority group. No one in the system thinks they are the villain. Everyone believes they are, quote, protecting order, And it is that moral confidence that makes the system more dangerous than any individual villain. Judy represents the underdog entering the system with the belief in reform from within. But her journey is not just a personal story, it is an illustration of a social truth. Individual reform is not enough if the power structure remains the same. Even if Judy succeeds, the system still exists. Prejudices still live. Laws can still be used to protect the old power, just with new language. A Bug's Life, 1998. Power Through Habit and Fear, Zootopia does not say the law is bad, but it poses an uncomfortable question. If the law is designed by those in power, who is protected first? In Zootopia, the system is still young and seemingly accidental. But what happens when that system learns to protect itself? A Bug's Life takes us back to a cruder, but no less effective power structure, exploitation maintained by habit, fear, and the resignation of the majority. Here, there are no formal laws, no constitution, no courts or police. But that doesn't mean there is no system. On the contrary, this is one of the purest power systems, where rules exist in the mind and do not need to be written down. The grasshoppers don't need to prove their power through continuous violence. They only need to appear long enough to create a psychological truth. We are small, we are weak, and we have no choice. That is how the most sustainable power is formed. Not by imposition, but by internalization. This system is based on historical habit rather than law. Paying tribute is no longer a forced act. It becomes a social ritual, a normal thing. And when injustice becomes normal, it is no longer recognized as injustice. Compared to Zootopia, where the law is used to legitimize power, A Bug's Life shows a deeper level. Power can exist even without the law. The law is a sophisticated form of power, but core power exists at a psychological level, where the majority believes they are incapable of changing the order. The character Flick does not represent revolution from the start. He represents something even more dangerous to the system, the imagination of other possibilities. Not rebellion, but the question, what if things don't have to be this way? And that is the biggest threat to any power system. Not violence, but consciousness. When Flick makes the community see that grasshoppers are not destiny, but just an organized minority, the system collapses not because it was defeated, but because it was demystified. A Bug's Life shows that power doesn't need to be legalized by law. It only needs to be legalized by collective belief. When that belief changes, the entire system collapses, not by blood, but by awakening. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1996. Sanctified power. There is a level of power even more dangerous, controlling not just behavior and belief, but also morality. If A Bug's Life shows power existing without law, The Hunchback of Notre Dame shows something even scarier, when the law not only serves power, but also wears the cloak of morality and religion to become beyond reproach. Here, power comes from the combination of the state, the church, and hypocritical moral standards. Frollo is not just a judge. He is the embodiment of a system where law, religion, and political power merge into one. The most dangerous thing is not Frollo's violence, but its legitimacy. Every act of oppression is presented as a moral act. Every manhunt is called protecting order. Every punishment is tied to the will of God. When power is tied to absolute morality, all resistance is turned into sin. Quasimodo is not just physically weak. He is a symbol of people turned by the system into living proof of deviance. There is no need to convict him by law. One only needs to make him believe that he himself is a mistake. That is the deepest level of control, controlling the sense of self-worth. Compared to Zootopia, where prejudice is hidden under the language of science and security, and A Bug's Life, where injustice exists through habit and fear, The Hunchback shows a more sustainable level, sanctified power. When power is seen as representing absolute good, its mistakes are no longer seen as mistakes, but as necessary sacrifices. And victims are no longer victims, but sinners deserving punishment. Esmeralda is not just hunted for her identity. She is hunted because her existence shakes the hypocritical moral structure of the system. She represents freedom, emotion, the body, and life, things that a rigid moral system cannot control. Therefore, she must be eliminated. The silence of the system, the Hunchback, does not tell the story of an individual villain. It tells the story of a system that is good on paper, but brutal in reality. It is a system where the law does not protect the weak, but protects the moral image of power itself. When placing these three films side by side, what stands out is not the differences between the worlds, but the similarity in how power operates. In Zootopia, power hides behind the language of order and safety. In A Bug's Life, power exists without law, only habit and fear. And in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, power is sanctified by religion and hypocritical morality. Three worlds, three different forms, but only one core structure. That structure is, power always comes first, and laws, morals, and social norms only come after to legitimize it. Law does not create fairness. It shapes fairness in a way that power can accept. In Zootopia, the law is written as if it were neutral, but it is enforced in a society full of prejudice. As a result, the law becomes a tool to reinforce the existing order. A Bug's Life shows a raw truth. The system doesn't need law if fear and habit are strong enough. When injustice becomes normal, then justice becomes unrealistic. The Hunchback of Notre Dame shows the most dangerous level of power, when it is not only legal but also considered absolute morality. At that point, there is no longer any language for resistance, because resistance is defined as sin. The common point between all three worlds is not the brutality of the ruler, but the silence of the system. A silence maintained by laws, beliefs, habits, and morality, rather than by the whip. Because of this system is more sustainable than any overt dictatorship. These three films, though labeled family or children's, do not tell stories about villains. They tell stories about systems that are good on paper and logical in language but unjust in reality. When put together, we realize a paradox. The more a system claims to be neutral, scientific, and moral, the harder it is to question. Because when power no longer wears the face of an enemy, it becomes the atmosphere. We breathe it every day, we live in it, and finally we stop recognizing it. These films do not ask us to hate the system, they ask us to stop being naive about it. Because the question is not, who is the villain? But rather, what system is making evil legal? The strongest system is not the one that oppresses, but the one that makes you believe there is nothing to question.